This week's Parsha, again, I apologize to the people in the diaspora, but we're going to be following what we do in Israel. So I'm going according to Parshat Shelach, which is what the Torah reading will be in Israel. So the central topic in this Parsha is the story of the spies. And so today what I would like to do is a close reading of the story, to in particular look at the background to the sending of the spies and to the actual reporting, and to try to understand what went wrong and how this became a major catastrophe for the Jewish people that led to a whole generation dying in the desert. So the first thing, let's look at the beginning of Parshat Shelach. You can find this in Numbers, in chapter 13. So that it begins as follows. Vayidaber Adonai Moshe lemor, God said to Moshe, Shlach lecha anashim, send to you people, v'yaturu et Eretz Canaan, who will, I'll translate this globally, spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Jewish people. Ish echad l'matei avotav tishlachu, one man per tribe you should send. Kol nasivahem. And I'll translate this, which is generally how it's understood by the commentaries, to mean each one is a prince in his tribe, someone who's raised up. Now, if you look at what we have over here, so first of all, it is God who's giving Moshe the directive to send spies. Their goal is to, the word here, which we'll come back to, v'yaturu. Okay, they will search out the land which God is giving to the Jewish people. And according to the instructions, he's supposed to take one person per tribe, each of them being a significant personality, a prince. Let's just turn for a second. Keep your finger, okay, we'll only do this once tonight. Turn to the book of Deuteronomy. This is chapter 1, verse 21. Or maybe we'll even start with 20. Okay, here is Moshe, who is giving his parting words to the Jewish people, his legacy to the Jewish people. Oh, I'm happy to see that David Shapiro said that they're not actually called spies. Thank you. We'll talk about that. Okay. So this is Moshe, as I said, giving the book of Deuteronomy his parting words to the Jewish people. It's very interesting that the first thing which Moshe focuses on is the story of the spies. Why that's true, you'll have to stay tuned for Deuteronomy. But what I'd like to do now is to simply look at how Moshe describes what happened. And obviously, right, this is 40 years, although it's not exactly 40 years, let's say it's 38 plus that Moshe is speaking. So if you look at chapter 1, verse 20, the Jewish people are on the cusp of the land of Israel in a place called Kadesh Barnea. And Moshe says in verse 20, and I said to you, you have come to the mountain of the Amorites, which the Lord your God is giving you. And then verse 21, behold, God is giving you the land. Ale Resh, go up, take possession, as God said to you. Don't be afraid. Don't be intimidated. And now let's look at 22, which is what's important to us. And all of you then came near to me. And you said, let us send men out before us. And they will dig out the land for us. V'yashivu otanu davar, they will return the matter to us. Et haderech asher na'aleh ba, the path where we will go up, ve'et harim asher navo bahem, and the cities that we will come upon. So the first thing which I want to note is that, to use the language, today's language, we have two narratives of what happened over here. If you look at Parshat Shelach, so the narrative is that it was God who gave the directive to send these spies. If I look at Deuteronomy, it seems to be that the initiative to do it was actually from the Jewish people. And furthermore, a big difference will be what exactly is the role of these spies. Okay, David Shapiro, you'll excuse me for using the term spies. I'm just using the vernacular. Okay, I could say these gentlemen, but whatever term we want to use, these, how should I put, fact-finding individuals, if that will be a better way of presenting it. Okay, so if I look at what appears in Deuteronomy, it seems that their role is essentially a military role, okay, to be able to check out what is the best way to come in order to now conquer the land, especially after Moshe says to the Jewish people, go up and take possession. On the other hand, if you look at what we have by us, there may actually be much more to it than that. So now let me begin with the following. So whose idea was it to actually send the spies? Now, somebody could say, well, we have two narratives. We have two versions, right? Which are very, very different versions, and to keep it at that. Or what seems to be an approach that's taken by a number of commentaries is to actually say that the two narratives are not contradictory, but in fact complementary. And especially tonight, I'd like to focus on the Ramban Nachmanides in terms of how he sees what's happening here. If I assume that in fact the two versions are complementary, and in fact what appears in each version actually happened, so then what we have is the following. When the Jewish people are on the threshold of the land of Israel, and Moshe says to them, as we find in Deuteronomy, okay, we are now on the threshold of the land of Israel. Go in, take possession. The Jewish people now come and take an initiative. And what they do is to say, well, we can't just go in and fight. So we have to actually plan our strategy. We have to plan our tactics. Okay, the way to do that is to send people in who will give us the lay of the land so that we will now be able to decide which is in fact the best way to come in and what our tactics should be. And therefore, one could say that maybe actually it was a welcome, how should I put this, initiative on the part of the Jewish people to send out spies. In fact, if I go back to what we were speaking about in the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, when we did the introduction, I mentioned to you that if the Jewish people are now transitioning from a reality where God is constantly in their midst, in their faces, where God essentially is doing everything for them, so now all of a sudden, maybe it's important for the Jewish people to begin taking control of their destiny. And therefore, the way to do that is, if we're going to go and fight, then we have to act like soldiers, and we have to now get all the information that we need in order to be able to now plan a whole battle. So that the fact that the people are now coming to send spies is actually part of the process of them taking control of their destiny. On the other hand, in our parsha, we have no mention of that. And in fact, in our parsha, okay, the the way it's presented is that it's God's initiative, and also it's being packaged, so to speak, in a different way. So this is what I would like to now look at, and to work with the assumption that in fact the purpose that these individuals are supposed to be fulfilling is much different than was actually envisioned in Deuteronomy. And in order to understand that, so let's look subsequently in our section, in chapter 13 in the book of Numbers. And this is in verse 17. When Moshe sends these people out, chapter 13, verse 17, it says, and I'll just for the sake of a brevity, not read it in the Hebrew, although when it's relevant, I will make note of the Hebrew. It says that Moshe now sends them out. Latur, and I'll come back to this word Latur, that seems to be very popular on the chat list. Okay, Latur et haaretz. And then Moshe gives them the following instructions. Moshe says, go up by way of the Negev, go up to the mountain, look at the land, look at the people. Are the people strong? Are they weak? Are the people numerous? Are they, or I should say few, are they numerous? And then in verse 19, what about the land? Is the land good? Is it bad? What about the cities? Are the cities unwalled? Are the cities fortressed? Is the land fat? Is it lean? Is there a tree? Okay, now, what I want to bring up is the following. There are certain considerations over here which are very important militarily. And that is, what is the nature of this people? Are there few? Are there many? Are they strong? Are they weak? What's the nature of the cities? Are the cities fortified? Are they unfortified? All of that is very much relevant to a military campaign. One might even add, check out the land. Is it good? Is it bad? That might also be relevant to a military campaign, because you don't want to go in areas that are going to block your armies. But on the other hand, the issue of, is the land fat? Is the land lean? The fact of Moshe telling them to bring the fruits of the land seems to be going beyond the issue of military considerations. And this leads me to the next thing, which is, if we were actually talking about spies, okay, who are being sent out on a reconnaissance mission, so then the most logical thing to do would be to limit the number of spies that I have, and also to be very discreet in how I send them out. And probably the best example of this, if you have it, so fine. If not, you'll check it out afterwards, is from the book of Joshua. This is Joshua chapter 2, where it says in the opening verse of chapter 2 in Joshua, that Joshua sends out 2 men, and there, David Shapiro, it says spies, cheresh. Cheresh means secretly, which means that there you have something which very clearly is for military purposes. And therefore, what do? Send out 2 people who you're sending out secretly. You call them spies, okay? So there's absolutely no question whatsoever about what their role is over there, which therefore raises the question, so why didn't we do the same thing over here in our parsha? Why send out 12 men, 1 person per tribe? Not only 12 men, but 12 men who are described as nisi'im, right, who are significant personalities. I might even use the following language, that you would be very careful who you're sending out, because you'll excuse me for saying this, anybody who's in the spy business, but you don't want to send out people, right, who are not expendable, right? Now, people who are significant personalities, what happens if they get caught? What happens if they will be killed? You don't want to lose those people. You want to send out people, right, who you think will do the job, but in the end, okay, you can live without them. So you're not exactly going to be taking Nisi'im. And therefore, this leads us to what we began with, okay, which the chat room has been, very into. Okay, and that is the word V'yaturu et Eretz Kna'an. The Ramban says, what does the word V'yaturu mean? Nachmanides says, V'yaturu means to examine very carefully. Okay, some people wrote to search out. Okay, it's to search out, but even more, according to the Ramban, it's to actually check out thoroughly. Okay, and the analogy which the Ramban uses, and he brings a certain verse, is somebody who's now buying merchandise. You examine it very carefully before you buy it to make sure that this is what you really want to buy. If I take that approach by the Ramban, so then it means that the purpose of the spies, investigators, princes, whatever term you want to use over here, is not primarily military. Their prime goal is to actually check out the land of Israel before the Jewish people come in. In fact, what I want to say now is, it would be kind of analogous to checking out your spouse before you become wedded to that spouse. With the idea being that when the Jewish people are now going to come into the land of Israel, take possession of the land of Israel, it's as if the Jewish people are now entering into a covenantal relationship with the land of Israel. It's as if the Jewish people are now being wedded to the land of Israel. And in fact, I might even add, it's actually a Catholic marriage. It's like once you're wedded to the land, there is no divorce. In fact, I'll refer you to chapter 15 in Bereshit, in Genesis, which is the covenant between the parts, where essentially God makes a covenant, or Abraham enters into a covenant with God, but it's a covenant with God, which is really a covenant with the land of Israel, where essentially God promises Abraham the land of Israel forever. And in fact, we'll do this maybe another time, although I've done this in my podcasts, that it's not only that Abraham is connected to the land of Israel forever, but the land of Israel actually guarantees the existence of the Jewish people forever. And so that the idea being, before the Jewish people enter the land of Israel and enter into this relationship, which is going to be a relationship forever, they will be checking it out. But now I want to say another thing. Not only will they be checking it out, but the Jewish people will symbolically be taking possession of the land of Israel through the agency of these 12 men who are going in. There's actually a very interesting verse which also appears in Genesis. Okay, this is actually at the end of chapter 13 in Genesis, where after Lot leaves Abraham, God then says to Abraham, let me just find the verse. Okay, chapter 13, verse, verse 17, 13, 17 in Genesis. God says to Abraham, Kum hitalech ba'aretz, get up, walk the land, le'orka u'lerochba, its length and its breadth, ki lecha etnena, because I'm giving it to you. Nachmanides on this verse says that actually walking the length and breadth of the land is a form of acquisition in Jewish law. When somebody acquires a piece of property, there is what is known as kinyan chazakah, taking possession of the land, and you demonstrate that by walking around the perimeter of the land. Although in this case, it talks about walking the length and the breadth. So what I would like to say is that when these 12 individuals are now coming into the land of Israel as the representative of the people of Israel, and that's why it was important to have one person per tribe, because this is how they are collectively representing the Jewish people. By them now walking the length and breadth of the land, they are symbolically taking possession of the land. They are now setting the stage for the Jewish people taking possession of the land. So that I want you to see that what's happening over here goes far beyond some reconnaissance mission. This has major significance in terms of establishing the relationship of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Now I want to bring up another point. If I go back to our Parsha, chapter 13, verse 2, where God says to Moshe, Shelach lecha anashim. There's always a question that when you use the verb and follow it with the word lecha, what does the lecha add? I'm sure that everybody's familiar with the expression lech lecha, which appears twice by Abraham. God could have simply said go. What does it mean, lech lecha? Go to you. And there are a few other places in the Chumash where God says to Moses, kach lecha, take to you. And here God says, shlach lecha. So I realized that there are a whole bunch of people who can say, well, that's just the idiom. That's the expression. Okay? But you'll find that there are many more examples of where we don't have the word lecha than where we do have it. And therefore, in any situation where we have the word lecha, so then the question becomes, what's being added by that? Now, I just want to point out, Rashi has a very interesting explanation over here, where Rashi in his commentary says, send them lid'atcha, according to your mind, according to your intention. And then Rashi goes on to say that God says to Moshe, you know what, Moshe? I'm not happy about sending spies out. But if you want to do it, go for it. But if you want to do it, then you'll do it according to the guidelines, right? The prescription which God is giving now. Which means that if you take that position, God actually did not want to see the spies go out. God felt that this was something which was superfluous. And one could say maybe it's also superfluous, as Nachmanides suggests in one explanation. He calls it the rabbinic understanding, because in fact the Jewish people were not the ones who were supposed to be waging the war of conquest of the land of Israel. And I think I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, that in fact the war should have been waged by the ark going in front and by the enemies just simply scattering and running away because they were overwhelmed by God's presence. So according to that understanding, when the Jewish people say, let's send out spies, it was actually a misunderstanding, a misreading of the situation. Because They weren't the ones who were going to, or should have been waging the war. It should have been God who was doing it. But Nachmanides himself actually says no. That in fact, his assumption is, yes, based on what you have in Deuteronomy, when Moshe says, go and take possession, that yes, the Jewish people were supposed to be going to war. And therefore, it was legitimate to want to send out spies. And then if you take that position, which Nachmanides does, so then what Nachmanides says is, there was nothing wrong in sending out the spies, but on the other hand, what God did in our parsha, and that's why we have no mention of what appears in Deuteronomy, is to reformat, to reframe the mission of these spies. Which means that God wanted it to be something which was much bigger. Which means that God wanted to guarantee the success of the mission. God wanted those people who were coming into the land to be significant people, because he wanted them to be able to cope with what they would see when they came into the land. He hoped that by having more involved, that would actually, in a certain sense, give them more of a support group and give them the ability to actually to reinforce each other in a positive way to make this mission successful. So that according to Nachmanides, rather than God saying to Moshe, I don't want this. If you want it, do it, but do it within these parameters. No, God is saying, yes, let's do it, and let's do it the following way to maximize the success of this mission. But now I want to just go back to how I got myself into this whole thing. So what does it mean, Shelach lecha? So what I would like to suggest is, Shelach lecha meaning send to you in the sense of you, Moshe, have to be in control of what's going on here from beginning to end. You have to now show your leadership in what's happening over here. Which means that God is saying to Moshe, this is your challenge. You have to be the one who's now going to set the parameters. You have to be the one who oversees whatever's happening over here to make this a successful mission. And if I now refer back to Deuteronomy, as I mentioned to you, in Deuteronomy it presents the people as the one who initiated the idea of sending the spies. But at a certain point, it might have been their idea, but then Moshe has to take ownership of that idea. Moshe has to frame that idea. Moshe has to now see that from beginning to end, he is the one who's in charge. And as we will see as we go along, and I think I mentioned it the other week, this was actually Moshe's failure of leadership. Because in the moment of truth, Moshe did not actually display leadership in terms of this mission of the spies. So now let's look at what actually happens. So as we continue reading the story, and I'm just going to go over some of the things briefly, when they're actually in the land of Israel, it says they go up, vayaturu, they actually check out the land, okay? From the Tzin desert, for those of you who are familiar with the land of Israel, the Tzin desert is where Ben Gurion is buried in the Negev desert, right? Which is the southern part of Israel, until Levo Hamat, which is the city of Hams in Syria, which means they're essentially going from south to north. As I said, going the whole length of the land of Israel. We won't get into the greater land of Israel now. That's not my interest. In any case, what we find is the following. it in particular mentions that they came in verse 22 to Hebron, and there it speaks of these different people, Achiman, Sheshai, Talmai, Yelidei Ha'anak, which I will translate the sons of Anak, which Anak can be the name of someone, but in modern Hebrew and not so modern Hebrew, Anak also means giant. And this will be relevant as we go later on. Okay, and then the last thing we're told is how the Jewish people essentially, or how the spies, how they essentially take this cluster of grapes, okay, which evidently is a pretty big cluster, and now bring it as Moshe requested to show it to the population of Israel. But now what I want to focus on for the rest of the shiur is what went wrong. What happens in the reporting, right, which then leads to a disaster. Okay? And we will start by looking at verse 25. Okay, and again, I'm going to do this in English, referring to the Hebrew where I feel it's relevant. So it says this, the spies returned from, again, mitur, from searching out, investigating, okay, thoroughly examining the land after 40 days. And then it says in verse 26, and they go and they bring to Moshe and Aaron and to all of the congregation of Israel. And they now return to them and to all the congregation and show them the fruit. So here's the first thing which I think becomes extremely important. And that is, if Moshe is the one who's in charge of this mission, if Moshe is the one who's sending the spies, the first thing which has to happen is that the spies essentially report back to Moshe. And here's where we have the first problem which appears over here. That rather than the spies reporting back to Moshe and then having what today we would call a press conference, where you then open it up to the wider public, instead what happens is they gather everybody together and in the presence of everyone, then present their information. And I think it's clear to everybody that it would be very important to have them first come to Moshe and to Aaron, report back, okay? And then perhaps to filter what is actually reported back to the people, or maybe not even report back to the people, because ultimately Moshe is the one who needs that information. But Moshe, it seems to be, and as we will see as we go along, seems to be very passive, if non-existent, in what's happening as the report unfolds. So that the first thing which happens is that they now gather everybody together, show them the fruits of the land. And then it says in verse 27, and again, visualize what's happening over here. It's as if they're talking to Moshe. There's a conversation going on, but it's a conversation which is happening in the midst of the general Jewish population. And this is verse 27. So they tell Moshe and say, we came to the land which you sent us to. And in fact, it is flowing with milk and honey. And here are the fruits. And then they say, Ephes, ki az ha'am. And I'll come back to the word Ephes, which for the moment I'll translate as but. But, and now let's look at what they say. And I'll do this again in the English, and you'll bear with my translation. But the inhabitants of the land are tenacious. The cities are heavily fortified. The children of the giant we saw there. Amalek is sitting in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are in the mountains, and the Canaanites are on the sea. And I'll leave it at that. And one of the issues that bothers a number of the commentaries is, was there anything wrong in what they actually said right now? And the reason why that point is really highlighted is because, excuse me, is because Moshe asked them a whole series of questions. And what are they doing? They're responding to his questions, right? Are the cities fortified? Heavily fortified. Are the people strong? Really strong. Not only really strong, but I give you a whole list of the different peoples here, how in every single location you have them. Did they report back about the land? Is it fat? Is it lean? Oh, look at these fruits. It's flowing with milk and honey. So essentially what they're doing is just telling it as it is. They're reporting the facts. And hence, there are a number of commentaries who say that in fact the problem is actually only later, when all of a sudden they maybe exaggerate, fabricate. For those people, okay, who wanted to say they're exaggerating, okay, right now, okay, the Jewish people are not fabricating. Right now, the Jewish people are telling the facts. But as I saw in the chat, Lynn, she's my Talmidah. So what you have over here is the following. There's always a question, and I always think about this when I watch the news on television. How much of this is simply reporting the facts, or how much of this is actually commentary, or as Lynn says, editorializing? Okay, and unfortunately, people don't realize how much the facts are being shaped in a way in order to create a certain or promote a certain agenda. Okay, and probably the simplest thing, which I think everybody can realize, and which is also relevant here, but in a kind of reverse way, okay, is what do you put on page 1 when you write a newspaper? Or what's the first news item you have on TV? And what does that say about, quote unquote, the agenda or the point that you want to really push? So yes, I could be reporting about 10 different things, but how do I prioritize it? And which is the one that I put up front? And which is the one that I spend a lot of time talking about? And maybe that says that already is not just reporting the facts, but that's already kind of shaping the facts and trying to editorialize, give commentary. Now, over here, there are two things which become actually important. And I'll start with the first, which is something which is, a rabbinic understanding. Everybody's familiar with the fact that on Pesach, on the Seder night, when we tell the story, how do we tell the story? So it's fascinating that the rabbis say the way that you tell the story is you start matchil bignut umesayem b'shvach. You start out with the bad part, you end up with the good part. And therefore, how do we start the story on the Seder night? We were slaves in Egypt, right? And then God came and took us out, ... Now, some people can say, well, obviously we do it that way because the fact is that's chronologically what happened. But it isn't just a question of the chronology. It's a question of whatever you speak about last is what actually sticks in your mind. Yes, we were slaves in Egypt, but God took us out. And that's the last image that I want to be in your mind, right? We were taken out. And in a certain sense, the fact that we were taken out overshadows the fact that we were slaves in Egypt. Which would have meant, if I followed that line of reasoning, we came into this land and we saw that the cities are fortified and there are powerful people there. And everywhere you go, there are different nations or groups that we have to start fighting. But now look at the fruit over here. What a country. What a beautiful country, which is worth fighting for. Which means that whatever you end up with is what's the image which is going to stick in people's minds. The way that it's being presented is, yes, the fruits are here and it's flowing with milk and honey. But do you realize what we have to do to get that? And it's not only do you realize what we have to do, it's mission impossible. And that leads me to the second thing, which is really where you get to the question of editorializing. The word ephes. Nachmanides says ephes means but. And everybody knows whenever you say something to someone and you say, yes, this is a great idea, but the moment you say the word but, you shoot it down, which means, yes, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, but forget about it. But for those of you who are familiar with this, you know in modern Hebrew the word ephes means zero, which here I think actually is beautiful. Okay, and therefore what it's saying is, the land is flowing with milk and honey. So what? Zero. It's worthless. Who cares about having milk and honey? Okay, when in the end, we're never going to actually get it. They used to have commercials in Israel. I don't know, I forgot what it was about, but they were at one point, I think it was about McDonald's or something, where they showed this, you know, this McDonald's and like these great burgers, and then they showed what hell is. What's hell? Hell is going to like, you know, to this place where they have all these delicious McDonald's burgers, but you're chained and you can't eat one. So I see it there and I'm like, you know, I'm foaming at the mouth, but I can't get it. So now think about this, right? Here they are, they bring the fruit, they're dangling it in front of the people and saying, you see this fruit? You see how great it is? Ephes, okay? You realize how devastating that is? In other words, I set you up like there's this unbelievable, gorgeous land. And what good is it if there's no way we're ever going to conquer it? So therefore, what I'm just trying to show you is that the problem over here is not just the question of them reporting the facts. The question is, how do you report it? And what is the impact that you want to make? And clearly over here, by the way that they're reporting it, the impact is to completely demoralize, devastate the people. It's like you're setting them up for the kill. It's like you show them the fruit. Wow, look at this great fruit. You can't have it. Okay, it's a way of making them realize, forget it. Now, what happens? Look at verse 30. And then Kalev silences the people to Moshe. And Kalev says, we will surely go up and take possession. We can do it. And here I want to point out, as you see, Moshe is totally silent. Moshe is in the background. The one who stands up to speak is Kalev. And Kalev simply says, no, we can do it. He's very emphatic. Alo na'aleh, we can surely do it. Ki achol nuchal, we surely can overcome. So what I want you to see is, this is the issue. Can we do it? Can we not? Kalev is emphatic. We can. But then in verse 31 it says, and the people that went up with him said, no, we can't. They're too powerful. Now, by the way, note, in this whole discussion, God is never mentioned. God is absent. And now what I want you to see happening over here is the people are now being presented with two positions. One position, which is what we call the minority view, is Kalev, where Kalev essentially says, we can do it. The majority view is no way we can do it. That creates doubt. That creates confusion. What do we do? And this is where you get to the next step, which is verse 32. Vayotziu dibat haaretz. And Nachmanides over here says, at that point, here is where the spies now fabricated, which again becomes fascinating, right? When you have two positions that are presented in an argument, and one position sees that they're not able to really make a decisive, right, victory in the argument, then they start lying. They start fabricating things to support their position. And what do they tell the Jewish people? In verse 32, the land which we have come to is a land which eats up its inhabitants. All of the people that we saw were men of stature. And we saw there the Nephilim. Nephilim is alluding to what appears in Genesis in chapter 6, a mythic race of giants. B'nei anak min ha-Nephilim, right? They're part of some ancient, mythic, powerful demigods. And then we get to the next thing, which is, Vanihi ve'enenu kachagavim, we were in our eyes like grasshoppers, v'chein hayinu be'eneihem, and so we were in their eyes. Now, what's the fabrication that you have over here? So there are two things. First of all, they say it's a land that eats up its inhabitants, which seems to be a reversal of what they said earlier. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. The two don't seem to go together, right? In other words, if you say it eats up its inhabitants, it means you can't survive there. Now, there are a number of commentaries who say that what they're actually saying to the Jewish people is, if you want to survive there, the only way you can do that is by being a giant. Look at these fruit. These fruit are like huge. Well, that's just a reflection of the land. The land is something which functions only if you're huge. But normal people like us will be swallowed up alive. This will be our burial, which means forget about whether we can conquer it or not. But even if we conquer the land, we won't be able to be sustained in the land. Because the land, the atmosphere, the environment is too oppressive. And then besides that, everyone there are giants, superheroes. Now, what I want to say is, remember I said to you, Nachmanides says that when it says motzi diba, it means that they're fabricating things. On a certain level, they're fabricating things, but on another level, what they're saying actually has truth to it. And what do I mean by that? On a certain level, the land of Israel actually is a land that is very, very challenging, that's very, very demanding. It's a land that expects people to be giants. And that's where I get to the last thing which they said, which to me is the key to this story. When they were in the land, and this is how they describe themselves, they say, Vanihi ve'enenu kachagavim. We were like grasshoppers in our eyes. V'chein hayinu be'eneihem. And so we were in their eyes. That expression is fascinating. We were like grasshoppers in our eyes, which raises the question, how do you see yourself? And as a result of how do you see yourself, what's the image that you project to others? So how do they look at you? And their problem is they see that they're grasshoppers. And if they keep on telling themselves we're grasshoppers, that's how everybody else around them is going to look at them. They're what you might call defeatists. Other people would say they're just small people. And this is really the issue over here. The land of Israel may be very challenging. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with saying, yes, there are giants there. There's nothing wrong with saying, yes, there are, Amalek is over here, the Canaanites are over there, the Hittites are over there. That's all true. But the question is, are you capable of rising to the occasion? And now I want to jump to something which is going to be, I hope I'll have a few minutes to get to these psukim afterwards. If not, so at least I'll get to the punchline. The problem of the spies is that when they see the giants in the land of Israel, that overwhelms them. They're totally demoralized. The moment they see them, they then look at themselves and say, we're grasshoppers. It doesn't allow them to see anything else. One thing which is definitely missing in this whole equation is God. God seems to be completely absent from their whole perspective. The idea that God took them out of Egypt, the idea that God will accompany them into the land, the idea that God wants them to take possession of the land, the idea that God will reinforce them, will enable them to rise to the occasion, seems to be totally missing. And therefore, if you look subsequently, okay, which is fascinating, and I just want to look at three verses. In the beginning of chapter 14, it says, and the whole congregation lifted up their voices, and they began crying, and they complained to Moshe. And the whole congregation said, would that we have died in Egypt or in the desert. Why is God bringing us into this land to fall by the sword, to have our women and children taken in captivity? And this is chapter 14, verse 4. Let us appoint someone, go back to Egypt. Now Moshe then falls down, but it's not Moshe who then does something. It's Joshua who then, and then Caleb who say in verse 7, the land which we came to is very good. And verse 8, if God wants us, he will bring us to this land and give it to us. And then in verse 9, but don't rebel against God. Don't be afraid of that people. They are our bread. God is with us. Don't be afraid. And this seems to be a major issue for the Jewish people throughout their journeys in the desert. When the Jewish people are confronted by difficult situations, one might even say in some cases by overwhelming circumstances, all of a sudden they become overwhelmed, demoralized, and become oblivious to God. In fact, what's even fascinating is there's even something worse which happens, which is actually what's articulated in verse 3, in chapter 14:3. It's not that they're oblivious of God, but all of a sudden God becomes demonic. It's like God set us up for the kill. It's like all of a sudden at this moment, God is going to abandon us, and it's like this was a sick joke. So that this becomes a question of faith. And this is what I would like to perhaps end with. Caleb and Joshua, who have faith in God, Caleb and Joshua, who really have that vision of the destiny of the Jewish people to be in the land of Israel. Those two combined give them the strength of character, the confidence to be able to say, we can do it, we can overcome. This is our moment of truth. Let's go for it. On the other hand, the other 10 spies, whatever you want to call them, who perhaps lack that faith, and I might even add, lack that vision, when all of a sudden they see the challenges in front of them, and what they said is actually true, they're grasshoppers. Or as I once said to a student of mine who irritated me, they're cream puffs. They don't have what it takes to be able to now become the people of God. I just want to point out, it's fascinating that in the modern state of Israel, in 1948, on a certain level, a similar argument happened. There were those people who said, we can't declare a state. The minute we declare a state, there are 6 Arab armies who are going to wash us into the sea. Whatever a Hitler did not accomplish will now be accomplished. This will be the end of the Jewish people. Okay, this is what was generally called the pragmatists. And then you had Ben Gurion and a number of other people who you might call the visionaries, who said this is the moment of truth. This is what the Jewish people have been waiting for 2,000 years. It's now or never. And we have to believe that if we now have this opportunity, we can make it happen. And it's because of those visionaries that we are now living today in the state of Israel, and I would say a very successful state of Israel. I think what's happening here is true about many things in people's lives, where people are confronted by opportunities, where people have to ask themselves, how much will I just be practical and pragmatic and be overwhelmed by realities? Or at what point is it that people say to themselves, but this is a vision? And I want to add a vision which is grounded and which presents me with challenges. But at a certain point, I have the faith that I can find the strength to be able to overcome those challenges. Unfortunately, the Jewish people did not rise to the occasion. A whole generation had to die in the desert. And it was only a new generation that could enter the land of Israel, knowing fully well what was awaiting them, knowing that in fact there were giants, yes, there were fortified cities, but feeling confident that God would be with them and enable them to actualize their destiny. And as I mentioned, which we're not going to go into today, unfortunately, Moshe did not take ownership of this situation and assert himself as he did by the golden calf, and perhaps allowed the situation to deteriorate in a similar way to what Aaron did at the golden calf, so that it needed to be Joshua who already here began that process of asserting his leadership and rallying the Jewish people to enter the land of Israel. May we always be able to have that vision and to be able to be ready to see ourselves in those situations where we can be giants, to be those giants, and to not allow ourselves to fall down to become grasshoppers. Shabbat shalom to everyone, and anyone who would like to stay, you're welcome to stay for a few minutes. Questions, comments?
Rav Meir?
Yes. Who's speaking?
Sandra in New York City.
Sandra, yes.
At the very beginning, when you were talking about whether or not it's like looking over a potential spouse, that their job wasn't so much spying, but to check it out, check out the pros and the cons, and make up your mind. Will you be wed to this potential spouse? I would just like to ask if that isn't in and of itself arrogant and wrong, because this was a gift from God to them. He's saying, here it is. Check it out. Not check it out and let me know if you like it and we'll have it. Check out what I'm giving you. It's just a slight rashomon, like changing the kaleidoscope. You're looking at it just slightly different. It is opening the door saying, go and check it out, but not checking it out with the option to throw it back in my face. In fact, so that's what I'm saying, is that I don't particularly like the notion of check it out with the implication that you could say, I'm not really in love with this. I'll check out another option. It was really what the Mefarshim said when they said, when you put it this way, there's no divorce. So I'm just questioning using that simile, because it's imperfect, and I don't think that that's really what God would have been happy with.
Okay, I agree with you 100%, and I'm glad that you're clarifying that. You're right. In this case, right, that wasn't an option. The option wasn't, okay, and if you don't like it, so then don't take it. But on the contrary, I think that the point was, and you're absolutely correct in what's your starting point. In other words, if your starting point is, this is the place, right, which is now being given to me, and I've been told is the land flowing with milk and honey, so now let me find that. Let me see that. And how much am I focusing on that, or how much am I focusing to try to find all the negative things?
100%, yes.
By the way, Sandra, I'll just say on a different note, right, which I think unfortunately today, okay, I would say I'll take the arrogant step of saying, unfortunately today, when people start looking for spouses, all too often they start looking for all the negative things and don't pursue enough the positive things. And maybe if you would try to look more about the positive things, you would actually find that the positive things far overshadow the negative things. So I think that's also, it's all a question of how people look at their reality and how much they're trying to actually, and especially, right, if I were to take the analogy, if you had a good friend who recommended somebody and said, this person is great, so how much do you say, well, so let me actually check that out and see how great they are, or how much do you start out being extremely skeptical and, and then try to find all the negative things? Okay, but I don't want to push it too hard. But the only reason why I said this was because there certainly is a concept in rabbinic literature, even in terms of a couple that get married, contrary to what the understanding is about certain things, that it's not like you just have a shidduch which is made and then you just come in for the marriage and without having ever met the person, right? The rabbis were very, very conscious about how the couple should meet and really know who they're getting before they get married. So I'm just bringing that was the basis for why I brought that up.
Thank you.
Rav Meir?
Thank you. Yes.
Bracha.
Yes, Bracha.
I was talking about the pairs, the pairs
about what?
The pairs of words that are used to see the land.
Correct.
It seems to me that the positive one is first to tilt in a positive direction, not as an either or. Is it good or is it bad? But is it good if it's bad? So to kind of push people in a positive direction.
Yeah, I like that. Yes. Yes, I like that. Okay. Yasher kochech. Everyone, so I'll wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.